will have the quiz about your topic last week. For now, we're going to discuss the basic concepts of laboratory biosafety and biosecurity. Now, this topic is very important in our profession because this deals or talks about safety practices in the laboratory and to make sure that you are working responsibly to contain any infectious microorganism from getting out of the laboratory. So lahat daw ng infectious dapat sa loob lang ng laboratory and properly handled and properly disposed. So that is what we're going to talk about here. In terms of lab safety, we're going to talk about the introduction, how to make sure that you are working properly in the lab and that everything you are doing is safe and not causing harm to yourself and also to other coworkers. Now, so let's talk about the different hazards that you can encounter in the laboratory. Now, these are the potential hazards that you can encounter. It can be coming from chemicals, also coming from the machines such as electric shock, 'di ba? Kapag yung machine hindi properly maintained, pwedeng masira siya, causing electric shock. Or since we live in the Philippines na lagi tayong binabaha, 'di ba? Kapag pinasok yan ng tubig, pwede ka makuryente diyan, okay? Another one, yun nga, yung mga nanggaling sa chemicals such as toxic vapors, yung mga toxic gases na yan, flammable liquids, 'di ba? Mga fire hazard, right? And also kasama din diyan ang mga injury that you can get from mechanical trauma. When you say mechanical trauma, an example of this one is the use of equipment called the microtome. That is the equipment that you're going to use to cut tissue sample. So kapag habang nagka-cut ka ng tissue, pwede na mahiwa mo rin ang kamay mo or daliri mo. Okay, yan ang example ng mga mechanical trauma or maybe you're not hindi ka masyadong careful and then nabasag mo yung mga glassware, 'di ba? Tapos nahawakan mo na nabubog ka, 'di ba? Nasugat ka. That's an example of mechanical trauma. And of course, poisons and biologic material. Example of biologic material, yung mga bacteria, viruses, parasites that you can encounter in the laboratory. So all of those are potential hazards that you can encounter while working in the laboratory. And this is something that we should not fear. Kasi nga naman, kaya nga tayo nag-aaral for us to have the knowledge on how to control these hazards and how to avoid this hazard, 'di ba? Para you are always on top of everything, okay? Now, ano ang basis kung bakit natin kailangan bigyan ng importansya ang hazards na 'to? Well, the basis of this one is the OSHA or the Occupational Safety and Health Act. This is actually originally from the United States, batas ito sa United States. However, in the Philippines, ang ating DOLE or Department of Labor and Employment, we adopted this policy na dapat meron tayong mga safety regulations in the workplace. And then, ginaya natin mismo yung pattern ng OSHA. Actually, ito yung ginagamit natin in the Philippines. Yung mga standards under the OSHA. Okay? And so that's why lahat ng workplace, hindi lang class sa ospital since this is mandated by DOLE, ibig sabihin noon, kung ano man ang trabaho mo, kahit nagtatrabaho ka sa food cart or nagtatrabaho ka sa kung saan man, sa call center or what, merong mga guidelines ang DOLE to make sure that your workplace is safe. And lahat yan under ng OSHA. Okay? Now, the OSHA standards, what do they regulate? If you're going to talk about the OSHA standards in the laboratory, these are the following that is being regulated. Una-una yung mga bloodborne pathogen standard. When you say bloodborne pathogen standard, these are the different infections that you can get coming from blood. So, ang OSHA, meron silang guidelines on how to avoid getting infected by these bloodborne pathogens in the laboratory, 'di ba? Another one is the laboratory standard. Ito yung in general na safety practices in the laboratory natin. And of course, respiratory protection standard. What are the difference? Ito yung mga standard different procedures na kailangan to avoid getting infected via aerosols or respiratory droplets. Okay? So lahat daw ng sneezing-hot mo, possible na ma-infect ka dyan. Kaya nga naman, mayroong mga standard practices to avoid that. Ano bang example ng respiratory protection standard na we practice in the laboratory? we wear mask, 'di ba? Nagma-mask tayo inside the lab. That's number one. Okay? And then marami pang mga iba pang bagay. Also, formaldehyde standard, of course, hazard communication standard. When you say hazard communication standard, this is the standard on how to communicate or how to educate the people in the laboratory about the different hazards that they're going to encounter. For example, the laboratory manager, they can conduct a meeting for the laboratory personnel to orient them regarding the different hazards that they're going to encounter and how to avoid them. Diba? That's an example of a hazard communication standard. Another one is the air contaminant standard. So similar lang sila ng respiratory protection standard wherein you have guidelines you have guidelines to avoid getting infected by respiratory pathogens. And of course, the personal protective equipment standard or wearing PPE. So when it comes to safety, sino ba ang responsible sa safety ng workplace? Dalawa class ang responsible sa safety ng workplace. Una-una yung employer or may-ari ng kumpanya. Pangalawa is the employees itself, 'di ba? So dalawa kayo na in charge sa safety na 'yan. Now, ano ba ang responsibility ng mga employer or may-ari ng ospital? Definitely, sila yung bahala when it comes to policy making. So, gumagawa sila ng mga policy, rules and regulations na kailangang sundin ng mga employees to make sure na safe ang workplace. Okay? So, sabi dito, they establish laboratory work methods and safety policy, di ba? Ano ba yung mga example ng mga safety policy that can be implemented in a hospital? Number one, wearing PPE, di ba? Wearing gloves, wearing mask, wearing lab gown, yan ang mga example, di ba? Ano pa? Number two, having adequate amount of staff. Kasi class, kapag ang staff or number of staff kulang, kunyari sa isang araw, dapat ang medtech na papasok is 50 medtech. Kaso nga lang, nagkulang, 35 lang ang pumasok. That is actually a hazard. Hazard yan. Kasi nga naman, konti lang yung staff mo, kapag konti lang sila, na-stress sila, prone sila sa error. Pwede sila magkamali. 'Di ba? So, pwede magkaroon ng aksidente doon sa laboratory kapag ganun ang nangyayari. Okay? So, yun ang example ng mga responsibility ng mga employers. Besides that, they're also responsible to provide guidance and supervision. So that is why they must be able to educate the employees and supervise them if they are adhering to the safety standards. And of course, they should provide materials for safety, such as safety information, trainings and seminars, and of course, the PPE itself, yung mga protective gear ng mga tao. Now, pagdating naman sa mga medtech working in the laboratory, dito na papasok yung employee's responsibility. So of course, bilang medtech, dapat marunong kang sumunod sa mga rules and regulations inside the laboratory. And then you should be cooperative. That's why dapat meron kang positive attitude. Ibig sabihin nun, class, madali kang sumunod. Okay? Kasama yan eh. Kasama yan. Kasi class, for example, sinabihan ka na, oy, hindi pwede na lumabas ka na naka-gloves. Hindi pwedeng ilabas mo yung gloves, 'di ba? Kailangan sumunod ka. Bakit? Kasi class, kapag yung gloves nilabas mo sa laboratory, nagkakalat ka ng infection sa labas. Kasi class, ang laboratory, madumi talaga yan. Nandiyan ang mga bakterya. Ngayon, kapag yung gloves na suot mo galing sa laboratory, nilabas mo, suot-suot mo siya papunta sa mga kwarto ng pasyente, edi yung bakterya, dinala mo na sa kwarto ng pasyente. 'Di ba? Kaya, kapag ikaw, sinaway ka ng supervisor mo, dapat positive pa rin yung attitude mo. Hindi ka mag-attitude na, ayoko nga, di ba? Hindi ganon kasi hindi safe ang ginagawa mo. Okay? Another thing is that you must be alert and give prompt notification. Ibig sabihin nun, class, dapat marunong ka makiramdam sa paligid. Kung nakikita mo na umuusok na yung makina, yung isang machine umuusok na, mainit na, you should inform your supervisor, 'di ba? Na, "Ma'am, sir, makakasunog na tayo dito." O kaya take the initiative, 'di ba? Yan ang example ng being alert and give prompt notification. And also engage in the conduct of safe work practices and use PPE. Now, when it comes to the signages in the laboratory, now the signages in the laboratory, they must be easily seen. Marami talaga mga safety signages in the laboratory. But besides that, besides sa mga safety signages, meron din class mga label yung mga mismong chemicals that you're going to use in the laboratory. Now, when it comes to the labeling of the chemicals, nandoon class ang tinatawag natin ng mga safety considerations such as giving the NFPA rating. When you say NFPA rating, this is the NFPA rating. Saan ba ito ginagamit? Example, this one. Okay? This is an example of a label of a chemical in the laboratory. Makikita mo may diamond dito, 'di ba? Tapos nakalagay diyan NFPA. Tapos sa mga diamond na 'yan, may nakalagay na number, 'di ba? Merong 1, 3 and 0. Ano kayang ibig sabihin nito? So titingnan natin dito sa kabila, okay? So sabi dito, dito daw, 'di ba may number 1 diyan, 'di ba? Ayan o, 1, okay? So ito 'yan, yung blue. Sabi dito, yung blue daw, health hazard yan. And then meron siyang number 1. Ano kaya ibig sabihin ng 1? Ibig sabihin nun, it can cause significant irritation. So it means, yung chemical kanina, health hazard siya, and kapag na-expose ka, it can lead to significant irritation. Okay? Ano pa? Oh, number 3 daw siya sa taas. Number 3, yung nasa taas na part, flammability hazard. Yan. Ano daw yung number 3? Can be ignited under almost all ambient temperature. Ibig sabihin daw, class, flammable yan. Pwede siyang umapoy. Pwede mag-apoy, class. Okay? Ano pa? Ito, 0. 0 daw siya dito. Ano ibig sabihin ng 0? Ano? Stable. Okay, so stable naman daw pala siya. So pwede mo siyang i-store indefinitely. Hindi siya yung chemical na basa-basa na lang sumasabog. Okay? Stable naman daw siya. So yun ang ibig sabihin ng NFPA rating na yan. So titingnan mo yung diamond, tapos may mga number dyan, and then ito yung ibig sabihin niya. Ito yung mga numbers, this is what ito yung ibig sabihin ng mga numbers na yan. And then this will be your basis para malaman kung gaano ba ka-safe yung chemicals na yan. Besides that, kung titignan mo yung labeling class, kompleto siya, di ba? Meron pa siya mga label when it comes to danger or flammable, di ba? Poison. And also, ano ba yung mga materials na kailangan mo to control this chemical from causing harm to the people, di ba? So, tulad niyan, sabi dyan is, when you use this chemical, kailangan gumamit ka ng safety glasses, safety shield, dapat nasa loob ng vent hood, meron kang lab coat or apron or gloves, and meron ka ring fire extinguisher na nakaabang. Okay? So, that is according to the label. And then kung makikita mo rin, meron ding class steps dito, di ba? Kung paano mag-first aid just in case merong injury being caused by this chemical. Okay? So, this is an example of a very responsible, very ideal label of a chemical in the laboratory. Now, sabi dito, the NFPA developed a standard of identification system such as the diamond. Now, the shape color-coded symbol which has been adopted by many clinical laboratories stands for the different hazard that you're going to encounter. So kapag blue, it is the health hazard. For the red, that will be the flammability hazard. For the yellow, that is the instability hazard. And for the black, that or for the white, that is the special hazard. And this is also another example of a label that can be found on a chemical. So, yan yung mga example ng mga label. Ngayon, paano naman kung yung chemical niyan is prepared in-house? When you say in-house solution, ibig sabihin nun, class, ikaw mismo yung nagtimpla ng mga chemical. Kasi, yung pinakita kong sample kanina, itong mga to, yan, tsaka ito, yan. Ito yung mga chemical na nabili mo, na prepared na siya. Prepared solution na yan eh. So usually nasa bote 'yan o kaya nasa galon, 'di ba? Ngayon, ito naman in-house prepared. Ibig sabihin noon, meron kang powder na chemical tapos tinimpla mo siya into a solution. Nag-prepare ka ng solution from that. If that is the case, dapat meron pa ring proper labeling na sumusunod siya sa standard. Ano ba yung mga data na dapat nandoon sa labeling niya? So dapat nandoon ang chemical identity, yung pangalan mismo ng chemical na yon, 'di ba? Just like this one, 'di ba? Meron kang pangalan ng chemicals. Okay? Another one, yung concentration, hazard warnings, special handling, storage condition, date prepared, expiration date, and your initial. Kasi importante nating ma-record kung sino ba yung nag-prepare ng chemicals na yan to make sure na tama ang preparation. Okay? So another thing that you have to consider is the safety equipment. So this is an example of a safety equipment na mandatory in the laboratory. This is what you call the safety shower and safety eye wash station. So ang purpose ito class is, for example, natapunan ka ng chemical sa lab gown mo or sa katawan mo, tapos nasusunog na yung balat mo, 'di ba? Ang first aid mo dapat gawin is to remove the clothing, tanggalin mo yung may mga yung damit mo na may mga asido, and then takbo ka na dito sa shower. Kailangan class kasi mawala agad-agad yung chemical sa katawan mo. Okay? Kasi kapag nagtagal pa yon, yung mga burns na yan, lalalim. Magiging third degree burn yan. Okay? So, ganun dapat. So, hatakin mo lang to, tapos lalabas na yung tubig. Hindi lang yan basta-basta class na may lalabas na tubig. Dapat merong pressure mismo sa tubig. Kasi baka mamaya, sobrang hina ng tubig na patak-patak lang. Walang maitutulong yan sa'yo, di ba? So, dapat daw, it should deliver 30 to 50 gallons of water per minute at 20 to 50 pounds per square inch. Ito dapat yung pressure niya. 20 to 50 PSI. Okay? Another thing is the eye wash station. Yung eye wash station daw na yan, dapat at least within 10 seconds of travel lang from the work area. So, dapat malapit siya sa work area. Para saan tong eye wash station? Ito ay kapag may tumalsik sa mata mo and then kailangan i-flush ng water yung chemical sa eyes mo. This is very important as well. Now, besides this one, kailangan meron ka rin mga other safety equipment such as fire blanket, spill kit, and first aid supplies. Ayan. Now, let's talk about the chemical fume hoods and biosafety cabinet. Class, ang fume hood and biosafety cabinet, they are different. Ito ang biosafety cabinet, this one. Okay? Para saan bang biosafety cabinet? Ang biosafety cabinet, para yan sa mga biological microorganism to avoid the spread of biological microorganism to the environment. Ibig sabihin nun, class, kapag ikaw, if you're going to process a specimen containing bacteria, ano pa? Bacteria, virus, fungi, di ba? Yan. Kasi mga infectious microorganism yan eh. Pwede siyang kumapit sa katawan mo. Ngayon, para hindi kumapit sa katawan mo, dito mo siya gagawin ang processing. Kung makikita mo, meron siyang glass cover, di ba? Yung glass cover niyan, nakababayan, tapos ang papasok nandiyan sa loob yung kamay mo. That's why yung katawan mo, yung upper body mo, protected na hindi ka matatalsikan ng mga bakterya. Besides that, yung airflow ng biosafety cabinet, controlled yan, di ba? Papasok ang airflow dyan. That's why walang lalabas na bacteria sa iyo. And then, since papasok ang airflow, kailangan lumabas niyan, di ba? Lalabas pa rin yung hangin. Saan lalabas ang hangin? Lalabas siya sa taas. Okay? And then dito, sa area na yan, meron dyan tinatawag na mga HEPA filter. Yung HEPA filter na yan, finifilter niya muna yung hangin bago niya ilabas. Para kapag lumabas na, hindi pa rin siya nagkakalat ng mga bacteria or any microorganism. So, yun ang purpose ng biosafety cabinet. Ginagamit siya kung ang sample mo to process have infectious microorganism. Okay? So, again, this removes particles that may be harmful to the employee who is working with potentially infectious biologic specimen. Ano naman yung fume hood, di ba? Kapag yung fume hood, this is only for chemicals. Para lang yung class sa mga chemical. For example, yung hydrochloric acid. Kapag binuksan mo kasi class yung hydrochloric acid solution, sobrang baho niyan. Sobrang sakit sa ilong, di ba? Tapos kapag sensitive yung lungs mo, pwede ka magkaroon ng irritation dyan. Okay? And then may mga chemicals din na pwede mag-cause ng cancer, di ba? Kapag nasingot mo yung fume, pwede siyang mag-cause ng cancer. Yung ibang chemicals. That's why, yung mga chemicals class, binubuksan siya inside the fume hood. Tandaan nyo yan ha. Wag na wag kayo magbubukas ng chemical sa kung saan-saan lang, di ba? Kailangan inside the fume hood. Kasi kapag yung chemical na yan, carcinogen, chamba ka ng cancer, di ba? O. So, hindi po pwedeng gano'n, okay? So, dapat always open chemicals inside the fume hood, okay? Ano ba ang purpose ng fume hood na yan? Kasi class, yung hangin niya, papasok din yung hangin. Ibig sabihin noon, yung mga fumes hindi lalabas sa'yo. Tapos may harang din siya. Ito, ang tawag sa harang is the sash, this one. So kapag nakababa yung sash na yan, kamay mo lang ipapasok mo doon. Tapos yung hangin papasok sa loob and then lalabas din siya dito sa taas. Okay? So, kapag naman, partially open lang yung sash, yung hangin papasok dito, and papasok din doon, tapos lalabas pa rin sa labas, sa taas. Okay? Sa taas pa rin ang labas ng hangin. Hindi ka may expose talaga directly sa mga chemicals. Okay? So, meron ding maintenance class na tinitignan if the fume hood is still working properly. Pwede kang maglagay ng tissue paper sa loob, tapos tignan mo yung direction ng airflow. Pag nagpasok ka ng tissue paper dito, dapat tataas siya papunta doon sa exit, 'di ba? Or if you want, meron kang smoke test na pinapausukan siya sa loob tapos tinitingnan mo yung direction ng usok kung tataas ba siya. However, dapat meron mga standard procedure on how to calibrate the fume hood. You're going to get the phase velocity na tinatawag nila. So, the velocity of the face of the hood with the sash in normal operating position should be 100 to 120 feet per minute and fairly uniform across the entire opening. Ibig sabihin nito, class, kapag daw nag-test ka ng airflow, kasi yung phase velocity, ito yung airflow sa loob ng fume hood mo. It should be within 100 to 120 feet per minute. Okay? Yun ang standard natin sa fume hood. Again, yan ang difference ng fume hood and biosafety cabinet Kapag fume hood, chemicals ang binubuksan dyan. If it is the biosafety cabinet, ano binubuksan? Microorganism, bacteria, viruses, fungi. Now, also, we also must store the chemicals properly because there are some chemicals that cannot be stored together with other chemicals. Kasi class, may mga chemical na kapag tinabi mo sa ibang chemical, pwede silang sumabog, yung mga unstable talaga na chemicals, di ba? And then also sa laboratory, when we are handling chemicals, kailangan natin ng mga safety equipment to make sure na safe lahat. Example of that is the safety carrier. Tulad nito, di ba? Mga safety carrier yan. Para nga naman kapag binitbit mo siya, hindi mo siya mabibitawan. Kunyari, imagine, di ba, kung acid ang nakalagay dyan. Kunyari lang, ay acid nga pala, di ba? Acid siya, di ba? Tapos naglalakad ka, bigla mong natapon yung acid na yan. Sino unang masusugat? Ikaw. Ikaw ang unang-unang matatapunan ng acid. Di ba? Kaya nga naman, whenever you are transporting acid, dapat nakalagay siya sa safety carrier. Okay? So, safety carrier should always be used to transport glass bottles of acids, alkalis, or organic solvent in volumes larger than 500 ml. Tulad na ng example natin, di ba? Besides that, meron tayong mga safety can used for storing, dispensing, or disposing of flammable in volumes greater than 1 quart. So, bakit kailangan meron ka mga safety can? Kasi nga flammable yan So, hindi mo siya dapat i-transport or i-store ng maramihan kasi nga flammable siya. Another one is the steel safety cabinets wherein ito yung storage, ito yung lagayan ng mga chemical, the steel safety cabinets. And of this is good for flammable liquids. And also, meron tayong tinatawag na explosion-proof refrigerators. Yung mga chemicals na dapat refrigerated temperature, doon mo siya nilalagay. That is the explosion-proof refrigerator. That is a special type of refrigerator. Now, another one is the PPE and hygiene. So this is very important pa rin in our practice. Always wear your PPE. So, ngayong COVID, since may COVID tayo, ito ang PPE sa laboratory natin. Okay? So, usually sa mga ospital, ito yung itsura nila. So, ano ba yung mga PPE? So, meron siyang safety goggles or glasses, meron siyang visor, di ba? Meron din siyang gloves. This one, gloves, meron siyang suit or yung iba lab gown lang, pwede naman. And meron din siyang foot protection like this one. Okay? Yan. Yan ang example ng mga PPE na ginagamit natin. So, sometimes may mga medtech na allergy. May allergy siya sa gloves, di ba? Kasi nga, yung rubber, hindi okay sa kanila. If that is the case, meron naman nabibili na polyvinyl or non-latex gloves. Pwede siyang gamitin if you have allergy with latex. Another thing is lab coat, proper footwear, okay? Respirator. Yung respirator class, um, yung mask natin, is it a respirator? Hindi siya respirator class, mask lang siya. When you say respirator, meron siyang mga filter. Ito yung mask, special mask na merong mga HEPA filter. Okay? Ginagamit siya if you're working with highly infectious microorganism that you can get through aerosols or droplets. Example of that is the COVID and also the tuberculosis. Now, also, hand washing is very important. So, pagdating nyo ng third year, actually, pagdating pala ng next sem pala. Next sem, aaralin nyo na yung proper hand washing na yan. And also, pagdating ng third year, uulitin pa rin siya. So, in the hospital setting, hand washing is done whenever you remove your gloves. Basta nagtatanggal ka ng gloves, dapat mag-hand wash ka. Another one is before you handle newborns. Okay? Yung mga baby na bagong panganak sa nursery. Bago mo sila hawakan, kailangan talaga maghugas ka ng kamay. That is the protocol. Okay? Kasi kapag nag-work ka na sa ospital, kukuha ka rin ng dugo sa mga bagong silang. Yung mga sanggol mismo, di ba? Yung mga newborn, yan, kukuha na mo sila ng blood. Siyempre, kailangan mo silang hawakan. And then they are very delicate, di ba? Hindi pwede na madumi ang kamay mo kapag hinawakan sila. Now, another one is hand washing is very important for infection control and chemical hygiene, 'di ba? Now, whenever you remove your gloves, your hands should be washed with soap thoroughly and warm water. And then, sometimes there is a need also to wash your arms up to your elbows. Sabi ko nga kanina, kapag ang hawakan mo ay baby, pati elbow, hinuhugasan yan. Hanggang sa elbow ang hugas. Okay? Another one is, if you're going to handle yung mga chemicals na carcinogen. Kapag mga cancerous na chemical or carcinogenic chemicals, dapat class, pati muka, face washing should also be done after you handle carcinogenic chemicals. Now, ngayon, since meron tayong COVID, hindi siya natatapos sa hand washing, di ba? Even shower, di ba? After you work with the COVID specimen, kailangan mag-shower ka muna bago ka lumabas at umuwi ng bahay. Okay? Ganun na ngayon. Ibang level na kasi may COVID nga eh. Kasama na dyan class yung shower. Okay? Yan. So, for the chemical safety naman, we provide the safety data sheet or the MSDS. Now, for the safety data sheet class, ito yung document, as in papel siya, literal na papel, okay? Na makikita mo kasama na mga chemicals na binili nyo in the laboratory. So, whenever you purchase a chemical, there is always a safety data sheet. Requirement yan, class. Anong nasa safety data sheet? Well, from the word safety data sheet, di ba? So definitely, ito yung mga information on how to make sure that you're going to handle the chemical safely. Ano ba yung mga information na kailangan mo na malaman para to make sure na walang aksidenteng mangyayari with this chemical. Okay? And these are the different information. So nakalagay dyan yung mga hazard niya, yung kanyang reactivity, paano kapag natapon, di ba? Spill and disposal procedure. Anong klaseng PPE, how to handle them, ano yung mga first aid, storage, etc. Okay? Those are the chemical safety or safety data sheet. Now, under the OSA laboratory standard, each laboratory should have a chemical hygiene plan. When you say chemical hygiene plan, ito yung protocol nyo in the laboratory on how to make sure that all of the medtech working in the lab will not be exposed to the chemical in a harmful manner. Kasi lahat naman tayo class talaga, when you work in the laboratory, yes, you will be exposed to chemicals. Oo, exposed talaga tayo dyan. Pero, there are some ways to mitigate the hazards from that exposure, di ba? Ano yung mga ways to mitigate the hazard? Example nga, tulad ng sinasabi ko kanina, when you open the chemical, make sure you open inside the fume hood, di ba? O you wear your PPE, right? Ano pa? You use safety carrier para walang aksidente. You store it properly. You read the safety data sheet, di ba? Ano pa? You wash your hands. Right? Those are the example yan ng mga chemical hygiene plan. Ito yung mga protocol, mga policy na sinusunod in the laboratory to make sure na lahat kayo ay safe. Okay? So when you say hazardous chemicals, there are those that pose a physical or health hazard from acute or chronic exposure. Sometimes meron din tayong tinatawag na teratogens. These are the chemical that can cause harm to the fetus. That's why kapag may mga buntis na medtech, dun muna sila sa area na walang masyadong chemical. Nilalayo sila. Minsan dun lang sila sa reception or dun lang sila sa phlebotomy section. Okay? Now, for the storage, again, sabi ko nga kanina, merong mga chemical na okay lang na sama-sama sila. May mga chemical na dapat kanya-kanya, di ba? So, stored separately will be the flammable solids, organic acids, oxidizers, water-reactive substances. Those are examples of chemicals that should be stored separately. Now, for the flammable or combustible chemicals, these are being classified according to their flash point. When you say flash point, this is the temperature that can cause them to ignite, di ba? Ito yung temperature na pwede silang umapoy na lang, okay? So, a flammable liquid has a flash point below 37.8, okay? So, that is the definition of a flammable. Kapag daw nag-ignite siya below 37.8 na temperature, flammable siya. However, kung kailangan niya pa ng higher temperature, 37.8 ang kailangan niya para mag-cause ng ignition or umapoy, di ba? Combustible ang tawag sa kanya. So example of those are the acetone, benzene, ethanol, heptate, isopropanol, methanol, toluene, and xylene. And also you have the gases such as hydrogen, solids, and paraffin. Now, let's talk about the corrosive chemicals. Now, for the corrosive chemicals class, ang pinaka-common na example nito are the acids in the laboratory and also the bases. Yung mga acid tsaka base. Ano bang common na acid sa laboratory? Yung hydrochloric acid, yan, napaka-common yan. Also, yung sodium hydroxide, lagi natin ginagamit yan in the laboratory. So, kapag napatakan ka sa balat or natasikan ka sa mata, sobrang sakit yan, sobrang hapdi yan. It can actually cause burns. 'Di ba? Burning 'yan. So ano ba yung first aid kasi kapag ikaw ay napatakan ng mga acid or base na 'yan? Totoo ba yung sinasabi nila na kapag daw napatakan ka ng acid, patakan mo ng base? Pwede ba yon? Ay, napatakan ako ng hydrochloric acid, kuha ako ng sodium hydroxide, punasan ko. Is it really true? Mali class kasi yung sodium hydroxide na yan, chemical din yan eh. Pwede rin yan mag-cause ng harm sa skin mo. As much as possible, do not add more chemicals to your skin, di ba? So yung sinasabi noon na kapag daw may acid ka sa balat, patakan mo doon ng sodium hydroxide, that is false. It can cause you more harm, di ba? Ano bang first aid kapag napatakan ka ng acid sa balat? Of course, wash it with soap and water. Kasi yung soap na yan, yung soap, basic yan eh. 'Di ba? May-neutralize na rin ng pH niyan. And of course, yung sabon, hindi naman nagko-cause ng harm yung sabon, 'di ba? O, so pinaka-safe talaga yung soap and water. Okay? So wag na wag niyo nang gagawin yun na yung nataptapunan ka ng acid, tatapunan mo sarili mo ng base, ano yun, 'di ba? Lalo mong pinalala ang sarili mo. Okay? So kapag hindi siya naagapan, it can cause burns. Pwede siyang umabot sa third-degree burn. Okay? Another one is the reactive chemical. When you say reactive chemical, ito yung mga chemicals na basta-basta na lang siyang merong explosion or ignition, 'di ba? Hindi mo siya ginagalaw pero bigla na lang siyang sumabog. Okay? So, they can spontaneously explode or ignite. Now, another one is the carcinogenic chemical. So, sabi ko nga kanina, ito yung mga chemical that can cause cancer. Ngayon, agad-agad ka ba magkakaroon ng cancer kapag na-expose ka sa mga chemical nito? Hindi. Hindi, class. Cancer, hindi siya spontaneous. Okay? Pangmatagalan yan. Ibig sabihin ng class, meron kang constant exposure sa mga chemical na yan, araw-araw over a long period of time, then you're going to develop cancer. Okay? So that is why in the laboratory, meron tayong mga rotation, 'di ba? Hindi ka pinapatagal sa histopath. Kasi kapag matagal ka na sa histopathology section, masyado ka na-expose sa mga carcinogens, 'di ba? So pwede kang magka-cancer. Kaya nga naman yung histopath na 'yan, every month dapat may mga staff diyan na nag-rotate. Pinapalitan talaga, may rotation yan. That's an example on how to mitigate the hazards, okay? So example of this one is the benzidine, common example of a known carcinogen. So this is the example. Yan, example ito ng mga spill kit na tinatawag natin. So kapag daw natapon ng acid, ito yung gagamitin mong kit. For the caustic chemical, these are the kits. For the solvent and also the acid spills. So those are example of spill kit. Kasi class, kapag nagkaroon ng spillage sa laboratory, ano bang gagawin mo? Let's say may natapon na acid. What are you going to do? 'Di ba? Basta ka lang ba kukuha na lang ng basahan dyan? Uy, kuha tayo ng basahan. Kuha tayo ng tissue, di ba? Punas natin sa acid. Mali, hindi class, hindi ganon. Kasi class, kapag chemical spill, kailangan mo na, you should neutralize first the chemical. Okay, neutralize mo muna yan. Kaya meron tayong mga spill kit eh. May mga binubuhos dyan na mga chemical din to neutralize them before you wipe it clean, di ba? Bago mo siya, punasan. Okay? Next is the fire safety. Now, for the fire safety, meron tayong tinatawag na fuel, heat, and ignition source for this one. So, para daw magkaroon ng apoy, dapat meron kang fuel, meron kang oxygen, and meron kang heat. This is what it says in the fire triangle. Now, bakit natin kailangan ang fire safety? Kasi class, tandaan nyo, you are being surrounded by chemicals and also by machine. Yung mga chemical na yan, yung mga machine na yan, pwede yan na mag-apoy na lang. Okay? So, anong kailangan mong gagawin dyan? First, you must be able to classify ano ba yung type of fire. Bakit kailangan pa nating alamin? Mayroon pala mga class ang fires, 'di ba? Sunog 'yan eh. Kapag may sunog, 'di ba, ang gagawin natin, tatakbo tayo, 'di ba? 'Yun ang unang reaction mo eh. Aalamin mo pa ba kung class A 'yan or class B fire, 'di ba? Actually class, kapag may sunog, as much as possible talaga, if you can defend yourself at meron kang dadaanan, tumakbo ka na lang, 'di ba? May dadaanan ka naman, edi takbo ka na. Wag hayaan mo na yung mga yan, yung apoy na yan, 'di ba? Kasi syempre, yung buhay mo yung number one diyan. Pero kung wala kang matatakbuhan, let's say na-trap ka, napalibutan ka ng ng mga apoy, wala kang matakbuhan eh. Ang solution mo na lang talaga yung fire extinguisher, 'di ba? Yan na lang talagang defense mo. So, doon mo kailangan tignan, ano ba yung mga nasusunog, 'di ba? Kapag nakita mo ang nasusunog, yung mga makina, classy yan, 'di ba? Classy fire yan. So, ano gagamitin mo fire extinguisher? Ito, this one, the carbon dioxide, the halon, or the dry chemical, 'di ba? Ano ba yung common kasi na meron sa laboratory? Actually, ang pinaka-common is the dry chemical na fire extinguisher. Yung pula, yan. Ito talaga yung pinaka-common. Kasi nga naman, wide ang kanyang coverage eh. Pwede siya sa Class A, sa Class B, and also sa Class C fire. Okay? Kaya kahit nga may dry chemical ka na fire extinguisher, sige, okay na, kunin mo na yan. Okay? Pero kung wala kang mga dry chemical, yun ang problema, di ba? So kapag Class C, ang meron ka lang halon, sige, pwede na yung halon, pwede na rin din yung carbon dioxide. Okay? So, yun ang importance ko bakit mo kailangan malaman kung ano ba yung class ng fire na yan. If it is a Class B, nanggaling daw ito sa mga flammable liquids. So, sa mga chemical to. Yung mga chemical biglang nag-apoy, di ba? Class B yan. Yung Class A, yung mga papel lang yan. Papel, wood, yan. Yung mga normal fire, di ba? For the Class D, yung mga metals, yung mga sodium, magnesium, biglang nag-apoy, di ba? So, in the laboratory, anong may encounter mo? Actually, this one, ito yung pinaka-common eh. Yung mga machines, electrical equipment, di ba? Besides that, ito rin, yung mga flammable. Okay? Ito, yung mga reactive mga metals na yan, hindi masyado. Except if you are working in a research laboratory. Kung sa research lab ka or yung mga laboratory talaga for industry, ito yon Class D ang pwede mo ma-encounter. Pero kung hospital lang, is either Class B or Class C fire, di ba? So again, ganun nga, ito yung mga fire extinguisher that you're going to need to combat those fire. So B and C tayo ang common, di ba? So, yan, kailangan mo ng dry chemical or the carbon dioxide. And also, for the Class C, you have the carbon dioxide, the halon, and the dry chemical. Okay? Paano naman yung mga Class D fire? Yung mga Class D fire class, kapag mga metals ang nag-ignite dyan, ang talagang common na nilalagay dyan to stop them are sand, buhangin, 'di ba? Kaya nga in the laboratory meron kang buhangin din doon lagi, pampatay yan ng apoy, okey? 'Yun, so 'yun ang gagawin mo ha kapag naipit ka sa sunog, kunin mo yung fire extinguisher then patayin mo yung apoy. So paano ba gamitin ng fire extinguisher? You're going to pull the pin, ito yung pin, pull the pin, aim the nozzle, ito yung sorry, ito yung pin. Pull the pin, this is the pin, you're going to pull it and then you're going to aim the nozzle, ito yung nozzle, this one. And then you're going to squeeze the trigger, ito. You're going to squeeze this one. Okay, and then sweep side to side. Now, let's talk about electrical hazard. Saan ka nagkakaroon ng electrical hazard? Bakit ba nagkakaroon ng electrical hazard? So, this happen if the machine is not properly maintained, di ba? Sabi ko nga last time, mahal. Mahal magpa-maintain ng machine. Ang mga maintenance class ng mga machine na yan, pwede silang gumastos ng 50,000 dyan, kada maintenance. So, kung every month ang maintenance sila, 50,000 per month, di ba? Kaya nga naman, sabi ko nga, electrical hazard din, ito yung mga common na accident kasi may mga laboratory na nagtitipid, ayaw gumastos, di ba? Pero hindi nga safe yung pagtitipid na yon. Kaya nga naman, that's why dapat properly maintain ang mga machines natin, equipment. Ano pa? Yung mga extension cord na ginagamit, yan. Napakanipis, hindi kaya ng capacity. Ano pa? Yung mga tangled cords, 'di ba? Yung mga frayed electrical cords. Ibig sabihin ng frayed electrical cords, yung mga meron ng sira na mga wires, 'di ba? Yan ang problema. Besides that, yun nga, baha, 'di ba? Madalas tayo nagkakaroon ng mga bagyo, mga baha, nababasa yung mga machine. Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng electrical hazard. Okay? This is the most common. Now, another one is the cryogenic material hazard. When you say cryogenic hazard, this involves handling liquid nitrogen. Yung liquid nitrogen na yung class, ginagamit siya to freeze tissues. So, kapag na-expose ka dyan for a long period of time, since, syempre, freezing agent yan, kapag in contact with your skin, pwede ka magkaroon ng burn sa skin, di ba? Pwede ka magkaroon ng, ng tawag dito. Kasi class, kapag na-freeze yung balat mo, para ka na ring nasunog diyan eh. Ganun yung kanyang effect. So burns din ang magiging effect niyan. Besides that, it can actually cause an explosion, pwede rin, asphyxiation, pressure build-up, embrittlement of materials, and tissue damage similar to that of thermal burns. Another one is the mechanical hazard, di ba? Example of this one are hazard from equipment such as centrifuge, autoclave, and homogenizer. So anything na pwedeng mabasag, anything na pwede mag-cause ng sugat sa'yo, mechanical hazard yon. Nasugatan ka sa basag na test tube, naipit yung kamay mo sa centrifuge, 'di ba? Napasok ka doon sa mainit na autoclave, nasugat ka sa homogenizer, 'di ba? Anything na pwede mag-cause ng sugat sa injury, that is the mechanical hazard. So example of that, yung mga may sharp instruments such as cork borer, needles, scalpel blade, and other tools, and of course, laboratory glassware. Now, ergonomic hazard naman, ito yung mga physical hazards mo in the laboratory. Example nito, yung picture natin, yung pagbubuhat, di ba? Yung proper way paano magbuhat. It should always be with your knees, di ba? Yung weight mo dapat nasa knees mo, hindi nasa back. Okay? Yan, para hindi ma-injure yung likod mo. Besides that, ito yung mga movement na ginagawa mo in the laboratory that you keep on doing for a long period of time, di ba? That's why you call them as repetitive strain disorder, such as tenosynovitis, bursitis, and ganglion cyst. So kapag lagi mong ginagawing action na yon, pwede ka magkaroon ng pain. So tayo mga medtech, ano ba yung ergonomic hazard natin? Ang common sa ating class is pipetting, di ba? Yung ginagamit natin yung pipette. So we use the pipette, we transfer the solution from one to another. That's why meron tayong pain lagi dito sa shoulder natin and then sometimes here sa ating kamay. Okay? Sa kamay tsaka sa shoulder, yun ang ating pain. Besides that, lagi tayo nasa microscope. So, nakayuko tayo. That's why meron din tayo mga back pain dito sa matagal na panahon na nakatingin under the microscope. Okay? Yan ang mga ergonomic hazard natin. So, kasama dyan ang position, posture, applied force, and frequency of repetition. How are you going to dispose them? Okay lang ba na basta ka na lang magtapon ng mga chemical? Yan ba ay tinatapon kasabay ng mga basura nyo sa bahay? Hindi, di ba? Hindi, okay? So, for the chemical, there are some chemicals that you can actually safely safely pour down the drain. Pwede naman na ibuhos mo lang siya sa lababo. However, kailangan, you should actually neutralize it first. So kapag daw acid yan, kailangan lagyan mo muna siya ng ng base para ma-neutralize yung pH niya, and then flush with water dapat. Okay? That is if it is water soluble. Pero paano kung mabaho, yung mga foul smelling chemical? Pwede ba na i-flush mo yan sa sink? Hindi class. Special disposal yan class. Kasi kapag yan binuhos mo sa sink, yung mga yung mga pipes sa sink masisira, matutunaw, pati yung mga yung drain mismo masisira, 'di ba? Tapos magkakalat ka pa ng harmful chemical. So hindi po pwede. Dapat diyan special na disposal. So sino nang bahala sa disposal diyan? Yung mga professional company for disposal of chemical waste. Kaya nga naman sabi ko nga, hindi yan tinatapon kasama ng basura nyo sa bahay. Meron class special na kumpanya na pupunta sa laboratory nyo to collect your chemical waste. And then sila na ang bahala mag-process sa kanilang facility doon. Now, let's talk about biosafety and biorisk naman. So, number one, pagdating sa biosafety is how to put on your PPE or putting on your PPE. Ano ba yung inuuna natin? We put first the lab gown, 'di ba? Followed by the respirator, the goggles, and then the gloves. Ang pinakahuli is the gloves. So tandaan yung order ha. Gown, mask or respirator, goggles or face shield, and then last is the gloves. Paano naman yung paghubad? Anong unang inuhubad mo? Yung pinakamadumi, which is the gloves. That is the first one that you're going to remove to make sure na yung kamay mo is dirt-free. Okay? Para walang dumi sa kamay mo. Una mo munang aalisin yung gloves, di ba? After the gloves, you remove your goggles. After the goggles, you remove the gown. Anong pinakahuli mong inaalis? Yung mask or respirator. Bakit class? Kasi just in case merong mikrobyo sa gloves, merong mikrobyo sa goggles, at merong mikrobyo sa gown, hindi mo pa rin siya masisinghot. Kasi nga naman, meron ka pa ring mask or respirator. That's why yung mask ang pinakahuling tinatanggal. Then after removing that, you have to wash your hands. Okay? Wash your hands. Kung carcinogen ang hawak mo, wash your face. If it is highly infectious, take a shower. Okay? Yan ang pinakahuling ginagawa. Now, meron tayong process called biorisk assessment. When you say biorisk assessment, you're going to assess what are your chances of getting infected in the laboratory. So for an infection to occur, you must need a susceptible host, an infectious agent, and the route of transmission. Now, you have two major sources of biological hazard. It can be through processing of the patient specimen. For example, nag-process ka ng sputum ng pasyente with tuberculosis. Since may tuberculosis yon, possible na ma-expose ka sa tuberculosis. Another one is handling of actively growing microorganism. When you say actively growing culture of microorganism, ito yung mga microorganism na pinapatubo mo in the laboratory. So, pinaparami mo sila. Since dumadami sila, na-expose ka sa kanila. Pwede rin through parenteral inoculation, yung natusok ka ng mga needle, di ba, or sharps. It spills and splashes onto the skin. Ingestion. Inhalation of infectious aerosols. So, ano ba ang recommendation ng CDC? So, sabi dito, number one recommendation is that dapat all of the students and laboratorians should know the bacteria being handled in the laboratory. Dapat meron kayong knowledge kung ano ba yung mga microorganism and how the microorganism can make people sick. That's why sa ating medtech course, meron tayong course na bacteriology, meron din tayong mycology and virology. Inaaral natin doon ang mga bacteria at viruses and how we get sick from them. Okay, importante yan yung knowledge. Pangalawa, dapat meron ka mga supplies only used in the laboratory, such as writing utensils and supplies at their workstation. Again, you must be aware of the organism that you are going to work for and look for the signs and symptoms of that microorganism. And you must also be trained for the biosafety practices and techniques. You must always wear your PPE and always perform hand washing. Now, for the biorisk assessment, this is a process used to recognize the hazardous characteristics of infectious agent that may be encountered in the clinical microbiology laboratory. So you're going to study what are the different laboratory practices that can actually cause infectious exposure. So ano daw ba yung mga pwede mong gawin that can lead to the exposure of that one? For example, you are processing a bacteria, pero hindi ka gumamit ng biosafety cabinet, 'di ba? Sabi ko nga kanina, whenever you process bacteria, always process inside the biosafety cabinet. Pasaway ka, hindi mo ginawa. That's an example na na-expose ka, 'di ba? Yan. Another one, ano yung mga likelihood? What is the likelihood na pwede ka magkaroon ng lye? When you say lye stands for laboratory acquired infection, 'di ba? And also, what are the consequences of that infection? Actually, class, sa laboratory, basta hindi ka pasaway, hindi ka magkakaroon ng infection eh. Yun lang naman talaga yan, 'di ba? Kasi nga naman, tulad sabi ko kanina, kapag bacteria, saan dapat i-process? Inside the biosafety cabinet. Pasaway ka, na-expose ka tuloy, 'di ba? Di mo kasi sinusunod yung protocol. Basta class, huwag kayong matatakot dito. As long as hindi ka pasaway, hindi ka magkakaroon ng sakit dito. Okay? Walang problema diyan. Now, ang WHO, they also classified the microorganism based on different risk group. So when you say risk group 1, hindi daw ito masyadong infectious. Actually, class, hindi talaga sila nagkakos ng sakit. Ito yung mga bacteria that can be found in the environment. Yung bacteria sa hangin, bacteria sa lupa, bacteria sa pagkain, yung mga normal na bacteria, di ba? Risk group 1 yun. When you say risk group 2, pathogen na yan. Kaso nga lang, yung sakit that it can cause, hindi naman serious. Pwede na magkaroon ka lang ng konting infection or magkalagnat ka lang, 'di ba? Nagagaling ka naman and merong gamot. Okay? So, meron siyang risk sa individual, moderate risk sa individual, and then low community risk. Ibig sabihin ng class, hindi siya kumakalat sa community. Okay? Another one is the risk group 3. When you say risk group 3, ito talaga yung mga serious pathogen talaga na talagang sure na makakasakit ka. So, meron kang high individual risk, however, low community risk. When you say risk 4, ito talaga yung magkakasakit ka talaga plus pwede kang mag-spread ng sakit. Kasi dito sa group 3, magkakasakit ka pero yung pagkalat ng sakit hindi masyado, mababa lang yung risk. 'Di ba? So ikaw lang yung may sakit, sa'yo lang yung sakit. Ito naman risk group 4, may sakit ka, mas sakit ka tapos nakakahawa ka pa. Ikaw yung may sakit plus yung mga kasama mo sa trabaho may sakit. Pag umuwi sila, may sakit din yung mga pamilya nila. Ano example ng risk group 4 na yan? Yung COVID, 'di ba? Yan, yung COVID natin, 'di ba? Kaya nga may pandemic eh, 'di ba? So, may sakit ka, nagkasakit din yung mga katrabaho mo, pag-uwi niyo sa bahay, nagkasakit din yung mga kasama mo sa bahay, 'di ba? Because of COVID. Okay, nangyari yan noong bago pa lang yung pandemic. So these are examples. So basahin niyo na example na yan ng mga microorganism. So based on the risk group 4, meron kang mga different biosafety level that you must able to practice. If it is the group 1, level 1 lang na biosafety. So mga basic lang yan. Pwede kang mag-work sa open bench. Hindi mo kailangan class ng biosafety cabinet dyan. Pwede class sa table lang. Kasi nga, hindi naman siya pathogenic, di ba? Sabi ko nga kanina, yung risk group 1, ito yung bacteria sa hangin, bacteria sa lupa, bacteria sa tiyan mo, di ba? So, hindi talaga siya pathogenic. So, you can work with those bacteria in an open bench. Pwede, kahit sa lamesa lang. Yung risk group 2, 3, and 4, pathogenic na yan, di ba? So, dapat doon ka sa biosafety cabinet gagawa. Okay? So, kapag risk group 2, this is being processed sa mga primary health services. For the risk group 3, for special diagnostic laboratory. And for risk group 4, sa mga dangerous pathogen units. Hindi siya basta-basta pwedeng i-process sa kung saan lang na laboratory. So, sa school natin, ano bang mga bacteria natin sa school? Sa school, we only deal with risk group 1 bacteria. Kasi nga, para lang siya sa eskwelahan, di ba? Itong mga to, yung 2, 3, 4, yung 2 and 3, sa ospital yan, yung risk group 4, ito yung sa mga special laboratory, sa dangerous pathogen units. And then, you can also actually assess yung mga potential damage or injury na pwede mo makuha based on those hazard, 'di ba? For example, exposure to COVID-19, 'di ba? If ever kung certain ka na yes, you will be exposed with the COVID-19. So dito ka sa 5, almost certain. Ano yung risk mo, 'di ba? Kunyari ang assessment mo sa COVID-19 is you're going to have major injury and single fatality, 'di ba? Kasi nga naman ikaw lang naman 'yun eh. So pwedeng mamatay ka of the COVID, 'di ba? So you can grade them as 20 like this one. So dito ka sa area na 'yan. So this one, yung table na 'to, this is just a way in how to grade kung ano ba yung mga probability na magkakaroon ka ng hazard. Okay? Pero for example, yes, certain ka that you will be exposed with COVID. However, meron ka mga PPE, 'di ba? May PPE ka, sumusunod ka sa mga policies ng laboratory, hindi ka pasaway, alam mo kung paano i-handle yung COVID, and then saang grade ka? Dito ka lang sa 1, 'di ba? Low risk ka lang. Low risk ka kasi alam mo how to handle the COVID properly, meron kang protection. Pero nung una class nung kasimula pala ng pandemic, 'di ba? Kasi nga naman hindi nga natin alam, 'di ba, na may COVID pala, right? Bago madiskubre ang COVID, yung mga health worker namatay sila kasi hindi nila alam kung paano i-handle yung COVID. So nandito sila noon sa level 4. Okay? Pero ngayon kasi, huwag kayong matakot kasi nga, alam na natin ang COVID, di ba? We know how to handle them. We know how to protect ourselves. That's why, dito ka na lang sa level 1. Low risk ka na lang dyan. Okay? Kasi nga, di ba, alam na natin eh, meron na tayong knowledge on how to combat the COVID. Okay? So according to CDC, there are guidelines of the safe and work practices in human and animal medical diagnostic laboratory for risk assessment. First is that you have to identify the hazards. You have to identify the activity that might cause the exposure to that agent or material. You must also consider the competencies of the laboratory personnel. That is why meron tayong face-to-face ngayon 'di ba sa school. Kasi nga naman before kayo magtrabaho sa ospital, dapat meron muna kayong basic competency pagdating sa laboratory practices and also laboratory safety. That's why may face-to-face classes yung mga third year natin, tsaka mga fourth year, di ba? To prepare them. Kasi importante yan eh, to make them safe, right? Yon. Another one is the evaluate the priority risk. So, ano yung mga likelihood na ikaw ay magkakaroon ng exposure to that? And what are the consequences? So, ito yung example ko kanina. Ano yung likelihood, tsaka yung mga consequences. So, dapat gagawa ka rin ng ganito. Okay? Another one is the develop, implement, and evaluate control to minimize the risk for exposure. So, for number 5, ibig sabihin yan, class, you're going to draft policies on how to minimize the exposure to that risk. Ano ba yung mga rules and regulations na gagawin para ikaw ay magiging safe? That is number 5. So, let's talk about the different biosafety level. When you say biosafety level 1, it means that minimal threat lang ito. So, tulad nga ng sabi ko kanina, ito yung level na ginagamit natin if we're going to handle the risk group 1, yung mga non-pathogenic na bacteria, di ba? Kasi nga, non-pathogenic siya. Yung level 2 naman, infectious agent na yan, di ba? So, pwede na mag-cause ng sakit. Gagamit ka ng class ng biosafety cabinet. So, they require a biosafety level 2 containment and practices are agents that pose a moderate potential hazard for employees and the environment. So ano dapat kailangan mong gawin if you're going to work in a biosafety level 2 environment? Dapat meron kang vaccines, 'di ba? You must be vaccinated. Example is the Hep B vaccine and tuberculosis skin test. And then always use the class 2 biosafety cabinet, and you must have a biosafety manual. And then you're going to restrict the use of needles and syringes in the laboratory. Now, this is the difference of a level 1 to level 2. When you say level 1, may kita mo, fume hood lang ang meron siya for the chemical. Wala siyang biosafety cabinet. Wala rin siyang waste disposal for infectious microorganism. Wala rin siyang signages for infectious microorganism. Okay? This is the level 2 facility. Kung titignan mo yung level 2 facility, meron na siyang biosafety cabinet, meron na ring waste disposal for infectious, meron mga signages for infectious. 'Di ba? Like this one, yan. Yun ang kanyang difference. Okay? Now, for the level 3 naman class, ito yung itsura ng level 3 lab. Kung makikita mo, controlled ang air inside the laboratory and selyado ang mga bagay-bagay diyan. Hindi basta-basta lalabas yung hangin. Kasi nga dapat contained inside the biosafety level 3 laboratory. Okay? So kapag level 3, infectious agent talaga yan that are either indigenous or exotic. Ibig sabihin noon, this can cause infection kapag nagkaroon ka ng inhalation, di ba? When you say aerosol, ibig sabihin ng klase sisinghot mo. Kapag nasinghot mo yung bacteria or virus, pwede ka magkaroon ng infection. Okay? They may have serious lethal consequences. So for the biosafety level 3, dapat class should be separated from other parts of the building. So yung access niya dapat limited lang. Doon siya sa bandang likod ng laboratory. Okay? And then meron ka ring anteroom used for access. Ito yung anteroom class, yung room dyan sa labas, dito ka muna magbibihis, 'di ba? Bago ka pumasok inside the laboratory. Then may kita mo may shower area din diyan. Yan, no? Pwede ka mag-shower diyan bago ka lumabas. Kaya nga meron siyang anteroom. Now, another one is that the level 3 laboratory, they require a ducted air ventilation system. So yung air sa loob, dapat doon lang siya nag-circulate. And then kapag lumabas siya, dapat meron siyang HEPA filter doon. Ibig sabihin ng class, yung air dito sa loob, hindi siya lalabas doon sa kabilang kwarto. Dapat, dito lang siya sa loob, nag-circulate, and then, kung lalabas siya, dito sa HEPA filter. Okay? Yan. And then, also, the ceilings and floor must be solid. Any seams must be sealed. Wala siya mga seam. All part of the laboratory must be constructed for easy cleaning and decontamination. Now, that is biosafety level 3. Yan, level 3 din yung class. Okay, nakita nyo, meron siya mga oxygen, di ba? Yan. Okay. Paano naman yung level 4? Ito yung level 4 class, di ba? Ibang level talaga siya. Kung makikita nyo, meron na siyang suit na positive pressure suit. Para saan yung positive pressure suit na yan? Ito class, makikita nyo, para may hangin sa loob, di ba? Kasi nga may pressure siya sa loob. Ang purpose dyan, just in case mabutas yung suit niya, yung bacteria, hindi agad-agad didikit sa laboratoryan. Kasi nga, may pressure dyan, pag nabutas yan, yung bacteria lilipad din. Kasi may hangin yan di ba? Kasi potassium yun, lalabas yung hangin, tatalsik din yung bacteria. Okay? Kaya nga tinawag siyang positive pressure. Tapos class, yung kanyang oxygen, nandito dadaan yung oxygen ng mga tao. Okay? Hindi siya basta-basta hihinga doon sa laboratory. Okay? So yung hangin niya, may source of air. Kasi class, dito sa kwarto na yan, wala talagang hangin dyan. This is the negative pressure. Negative pressure room yan. No air inside the lab. That's why yung source lang ng kanilang oxygen is this one. Ito lang. Kanina, yung level 3, kung may hangin pa rin naman dyan. Okay? Pero, gumagamit sila ng respirator na. This one, di ba? Yung may HEPA filter dyan. Dito sila humihinga through the HEPA filter. Ito naman na level 4 talaga, walang hangin talaga sa environment. Walang hangin dyan. Saan nanggagaling yung oxygen nila? Dito lang. Dito lang. Okay? Yan ang mga difference nila. Tapos, they use the positive pressure suit. This is the level 4 lab. So, kapag daw level 4 lab, dapat meron siyang separate na building. Yan. Should be in a separate building or in isolated zone within the building. And also, restricted lang ang access. Meron lang mga tao na pwede makapasok doon. So, also, you must have the cabinet and the suit for that. And then you're going to use the class 3 biosafety cabinet for that. Again, for the level 4, use the class 3 biosafety cabinet. So, personal enter and exit the laboratory through the clothing changing room. So, dapat class, mag-shower ka rin dyan Yan whenever you leave the laboratory, dapat meron kang change of clothes and shower. And then yung ginamit mong damit doon mo rin siya lalaban. 'Di ba? They should be decontaminated pa. So doon na rin naglalaba in the laboratory. Tapos, yung level 4 lab na yan, meron siyang dedicated non-recirculating ventilation system which is filtered through the HEPA filter before being exhausted. Yon. So that this is the level 4 laboratory. Now, these are the different types of biosafety cabinet. Ito yung class 1 natin. This is the class 2 and also the class 3. Okay, so, sorry, this is the class 1 pala. Class 1, class 2, and class 3. This is the class 3, yung letter C. So let's talk about the class 1 biological safety cabinet. So for the class 1, yung air niya papasok and then pataas ang labas. Ganun lang siya, papasok dito and then tataas siya, lalabas na siya. And dapat it will pass through the HEPA filter. Just like this one. Air comes in, air goes up to the HEPA filter, air comes out. Okay? So the air is circulated within the safety hood, passing the HEPA filter before reaching the environment outside the hood. For the class 2 naman class, yung air niya papasok, bababa, tataas, and then lalabas uli, tataas, punta sa filter, lalabas na siya. So the air is pulled inward and downward by a blower and pass up through the airflow plenum where it passes through a HEPA filter before reaching the work surface. And then the percentage of remaining air is HEPA filtered before reaching the environment. Ibig sabihin nun, papasok daw siya, tapos bababa, tapos lalabas uli dito, tapos papasok uli dito sa baba, and then lalabas na siya sa HEPA filter. Okay? Yun yung kanyang airflow. Papasok siya, bababa, lalabas ulit, bababa ulit, and then exhaust na. Okay? This is the class 2 biosafety cabinet. And then this is the cabinet we have in the laboratory. Another one is the class 3. For the class 3, may kita nyo, selyado talaga siya, di ba? Yung specimen, papasok mo lang dito yung specimen. And then, isi-seal mo yan. Kapag nakaseal na, papasok mo yung kamay mo dito, gloves yan ha, meron ng gloves dito, papasok mo, and then kukunin mo na yung specimen dito. Okay? Ganun siya. So, completely sealed off talaga siya. So, for the class 3 biosafety cabinet hood is a self-contained ventilated system for highly infectious microorganism or materials and provide the highest level of personal protection. So, yung air niya, papasok dito, and then bababa, tapos lalabas din. So, ganun siya. Papasok, bababa, and lalabas. Tapos, yung kamay mo, papasok lang dyan. Meron ng gloves inside. Now, let's talk about biosecurity. For the biosecurity naman, the objective of this one is prevent the loss, theft, or misuse of microorganism. So, bakit importante ang biosecurity? Kasi class, nagkaroon din tayo ng tinatawag na bioterrorism wherein ginagamit yung mga microorganism to cause harm sa mga tao. So, this is accomplished by limiting access to facilities, research material, and information. So that's why biosecurity is very important. You must make sure that those microorganisms will not go to the bad people. Kasi mga bad people na yan, yung mga terorista, pwede silang magkalat ng sakit sa mundo. So what are the different elements of a biosafety program? First of all, you must have a program management. So dapat meron kayong mga standard procedure pagdating sa biosecurity. You must have an organizational structure. You must have a chain of command, roles and responsibilities. Sino ba yung mga staff in charge sa biosecurity? And methods of limiting access inside the laboratory. Kaya nga may sabi tayo na authorized personnel only. Next, the personal management. Kasi dapat class, you must identify kung yung mga tao ba working in the lab are really scientists. Kasi baka mamaya, meron diyang terorista, nagpapanggap na scientist. Yung pala, terorista siya. Na siya yung kukuha ng mga microorganism doon, di ba? Also, dapat yung mga staff na yan, yung mga employees na yan, should be knowledgeable in how to handle, use, and store, and transport dangerous pathogens and other important assets. And you must also identify sino ba yung mga visitor, di ba? Sino lang ang pwede pumasok sa laboratory. Usually class, kapag mga highly secured laboratory, walang visitor, bawal ang visitor class. And then yung mga employees dyan are scrutinized and merong background check. Next is the inventory and accountability. Now, this is very important kasi nga naman kapag mayroong nawala, dapat alam mo. When you say inventory, ibig sabihin ng class, binibilang mo yung mga bacteria dyan, yung mga microorganism being stored, kung gaano ba karami ang sample inventory mo. And also, you must know saan sila nakalagay. Kasi class, sa mga laboratory na malalaki ng ganyan, hindi lang naman isang ref yan eh. Hindi lang yan isang cabinet. Marami yan, di ba? For example, sa cabinet 1, nakalagay doon yung COVID. Sa cabinet 2, nandiyan ang SARS. Cabinet 3, nandiyan ang MERS. Cabinet 4, nandiyan ang tuberculosis, di ba? Cabinet 5, nandiyan ang anthrax. So, dapat alam mo. At dapat alam mo kung gaano karaming specimen. So, kunyari, cabinet 1, merong 100 COVID sample. Cabinet 2, meron kang 200 SARS sample. Cabinet 5, meron kang 50 anthrax sample. Diba? Yan ang example ng inventory and accountability. So, you must be able to track the inventory, storage, use, transfer, and destruction of biological material and assets when no longer needed. Kasi class, kapag merong nawala doon, merong nabawas, dapat alam mo kung saan siya napunta. Yan no, you must be able to track. Alam mo kung nasaan, 'di ba? So kung 100 ang specimen sa cabinet 1 at naging 99 na lang, dapat alam mo kung nasaan napunta. Okay? So you should know where they are located and who is responsible for them. So to achieve this, management should define the materials or forms subject to accountability measure, records to be maintained, record maintenance, operating procedure associated with inventory maintenance, and documentation and reporting requirements. Ibig sabihin nun, class, kunyari, meron kang kinuhang specimen. Sa cabinet A, meron siya ang 100 COVID sample. Tapos, kukuha ka ng isang test tube. Magiging 99 na lang, di ba? Dapat sa record mo nakalagay doon, December 11, borrowed one test tube of COVID sample going to laboratory A for testing. Dapat naka-record siya. Kasi, kung bigla na lang nawala yung isang test tube, tas walang record, saan napunta, 'di ba? 'Yon. So pwede ka ma-alarma doon kasi pwede may magkalat ng sakit sa buong mundo. Another one is information security. This is also very important. When you say information security, ito yung mga data. Data about that agent. Okay? Kasi nga naman, kapag pinag-aralan mo na yung virus, tapos nakita mo na, based on your data, itong virus na to, deadly to. Pwede mag-cause ng pandemic to. Kapag yung data na yan nag-leak, nalaman ng mga terorista, pwede na pag-interesan yung virus mo doon. So, pwede nilang nakawin yun. Okay? That's why sensitive information may include facility security plan, access control, agent inventory, and storage location. So, the objective of this one is to protect the information from unauthorized release and to ensure that the appropriate level of confidentiality is preserved. Tandaan nyo, class, whatever you put online, hindi siya secure. That's why dapat meron din tayong mga information security program. Also, transport of biological agents, 'di ba? For the transport of the agents, dapat properly pack siya. Properly ang kanyang packaging like this one. Meron kang carton dito na merong outer label, tapos sa loob niya, meron siyang canister dito, 'di ba? And then meron ka pa ring mga tubes dito. Okay? Bakit? Kasi importante dito class, hindi siya matapon. Kasi nga naman kapag natapon yan at infectious yun, edi nagkalat ka na ng sakit sa buong mundo. Kunwari, you're going to transport this one sa Amerika. So, nanggaling siya sa Japan, pupunta ng Amerika, di ba? Natapon, nabasag. Edi nagkalat-kalat na, di ba? So, pwede kang magkalat ng sakit because of that. Okay? So, that's why dapat proper ang transportation niya. So, transport policy should address the need for appropriate documentation and material accountability and control between the procedures for pathogen in transit between location. You should have proper containment like this one, 'di ba? Packaging like this, labeling ito, documentation and transport of biologic materials. So, this is the example ng packaging niya. May kita mo meron siyang outer packaging. Meron din siyang secondary packaging na canister. Tapos, sa loob niya, meron pang foam. Foam yan, class. Absorbing material yan. Para just in case, merong mabasag dyan, may natapon, ma-absorb siya, hindi siya kakalat, di ba? And then, the primary receptacle or the test tube. So, hindi lang basta-basta na binalot mo lang yung test tube, pinadala mo sa Amerika, hindi gano'n. Dapat meron siyang mga label, 'yan. Packaging na secondary na canister, 'di ba? Meron kang foam dito na absorbent, and then meron kang test tube na plastic na hindi talaga mababasag, and of course, the waterproof cap. So, paano naman ang accident or injury plan? So, just in case nagkaroon ka ng injury or accident in the laboratory, dapat alam mo kung anong gagawin. That's why dapat meron kang mga safety drills dyan. And you must be able to know how to contact the authorities. So, number one is the preservation of human life. This is very important. Now, besides that, you must be able to coordinate with the authorities, which are the medical, fire, police, and other emergency officials, and identify the different risks such as bomb threat, natural disaster, severe weather, and power outages. Another thing is reporting and communication. So, the communication chain should include the laboratory and program official, institution management, and other relevant authority. Para saan class ang reporting and communication? So, this is used to make sure that all of the data, all of the information needed are being delivered to the proper people. So, kung ano man yung communication na kailangan, kunyari nagkaroon ng emergency, 'di ba, sa laboratory, sinong dapat tawagan? Dapat yung mga medical officers. Puwede rin ang fire department or the police. Again, training and practice drill. This is very good pagdating sa mga emergency. So, dapat meron kayong fire drill, building evacuation drill associated with bomb threats. Loss or theft of materials, emergency response to accident or injuries, incident report and identification of and response to security breaches. So, ano yung mga practice nyo, yung mga trainings nyo, just in case nangyari ang mga bagay na ito. Another one is the security update and re-evaluation. So, from time to time, you must be able to re-evaluate the security in your facility. Effective pa ba ang security? Kasi class, kapag merong nawala dyan, ibig sabihin noon, hindi na effective ang security measures nyo. That's why you must be re-evaluated from time to time. Now, when you say bioterrorism, meron kang dalawang klase class. Meron kang overt, meron ka ring covert. When you say overt bioterrorism, it means that yung mismong terorista on the spot, nagkalat siya ng harm. Kunyari, may bomba, 'di ba? Yan, sumabog yung bomba sa harapan mo, overt bioterrorism 'yon. Tapos yung bomba pala may kasamang mga microorganism, 'di ba? Kumalat, right? Overt 'yan. Pero kapag naman covert, hindi natin alam. Unti-unti na lang palang kumakalat. Tulad na lang ng nagtapon sila ng microorganism sa tubig, 'di ba? Tapos inom tayo ng inom ng tubig, di natin alam, right? 'Yun ang example ng covert bioterrorism. So, for the overt, the impact will be immediate and there will be early recognition of the event. Tulad ng pagsabog, di ba? Yan ang overt. For the covert naman, the recognition as well as the response could be delayed, allowing the disease to disseminate through the population. Just like, yun nga, nagtapon sila ng bacteria or virus sa tubig, di ba? Tapos kumalat yung tubig na infected, ininom ng mga tao, unti-unti nagkasakit yung mga tao. That is the covert bioterrorism. So ano ba yung mga common na agent na ginagamit ng mga terrorist? Ito yon, the Bacillus anthracis, Brucella, tuberculosis, yan. Ito yung mga pwede nilang gamitin na bioweapon against us. Now, for the biological warfare, this is the deliberate use of bacteria, viruses, fungi, or toxin to injure people, animals, or crops to gain a military advantage for political gain. So, when you say biological warfare, gumagamit sila ng mga microorganism to cause harm sa isang gobyerno, sa isang society. Ang pinaka-common dyan klase yung anthrax, di ba? Bacillus anthracis. This is the one that causes anthrax. Yan ang lagi nila na kinakalat. Okay, so that is the topic for this week. Do you have questions for the lecture for today?